The year is 1943, Eastern Front. A Tiger I commander named Oberleutnant Hans Bölter sits motionless in his cupola, watching the horizon through vision blocks smeared with mud and frost. The temperature inside the tank hovers near freezing despite the engine heat. Outside, it's minus 30 degrees Celsius. His crew has been operational for 14 hours. The Tiger weighs 54 tons, and right now every single one of those tons feels like a chain around his neck. In 6 minutes, his transmission will fail for the third time this week. In 12 minutes, he'll have to decide whether to abandon the most powerful tank in the German arsenal or stay with it and risk encirclement. His hands rest on the rim of the cupola, steady, trained, disciplined. But inside his mind, a question he's been avoiding for months finally surfaces with terrible clarity. What if the weapon they told him was invincible is actually killing them faster than the enemy ever could? This is the story of the Tiger I, Germany's legendary heavy tank, the machine that became a symbol of German armored supremacy and tactical genius. But it's really about the moment when engineering ambition collided with logistical reality, when the pursuit of perfection created a weapon too complex to sustain. And what it reveals about the gap between mythology and mathematics, between what propaganda promises and what mechanics can deliver, between the tank you want and the tank you can actually keep running when you're 1,000 kilometers from the nearest spare part. August 1942. The Tiger. I rolls off the production line at Henschel. 88mm gun, 100mm of frontal armor, 600 horsepower Maybach engine. On paper, it's a masterpiece. In the testing grounds at Kummersdorf, it performs beyond expectations. Shells that would gut a Soviet T-34 bounce off its glacis plate like hailstones. Its gun can penetrate any Allied tank at ranges where return fire is impossible. German High Command watches the demonstrations and sees destiny. They see Blitzkrieg II. 0. They see the Eastern Front stabilized, the Western Allies stopped cold, the war turned around through sheer technological superiority. What they don't see, what nobody sees yet, is the trap being built into every rivet and gear. To understand what the Tiger became, you first need to understand what the crews believed it was. They believed they were climbing into the finest heavy tank ever built. Not good, not competitive, the finest. This wasn't arrogance. It was doctrine, reinforced by every propaganda film, every newsreel, every report from the front that showed Tigers dominating battlefields. They believed that German engineering was a force multiplier, that one Tiger equaled 10 enemy tanks, that technical excellence would compensate for growing numerical disadvantages. They believed the tank would protect them, that its armor was a fortress, that its mechanical complexity was a feature, not a flaw. The Tiger wasn't just a weapon, it was proof of concept, a rolling monument to the idea that quality defeats quantity, that precision engineering conquers mass production, that a smaller force with better equipment can hold off a larger one indefinitely. The first cracks in that belief system appeared not in combat, but in transit. Moving a Tiger to the front was an engineering nightmare that revealed problems the test grounds never simulated. The tank was too wide for standard rail cars, too heavy for most bridges. Its tracks had to be swapped, narrow ones for rail transport, wide combat tracks for operations. This wasn't a 5-minute job. It required jacks, tools, time, and crews who were exhausted before they ever reached the battlefield. Fuel consumption was catastrophic, 2.1 liters per kilometer on roads, worse cross-country. A Tiger with a full tank could cover roughly 100 kilometers before needing resupply. The Eastern Front was measured in thousands of kilometers. Do the math. Every Tiger advance required a logistics train that was itself vulnerable to attack, breakdowns, and the simple, brutal physics of distance. Then came the transmission. The Maybach HL230 engine produced enormous power, but the transmission and final drives couldn't handle the torque, combined with the tank's mass. Gears stripped, seals failed. The entire system required constant maintenance by skilled mechanics using specialized tools. On the production line, this was manageable. In a frozen field 200 kilometers behind enemy lines, with Soviet artillery bracketing your position and no spare parts, it was catastrophic. Breakdowns weren't occasional, they were routine. Some Tiger units spent more time repairing their tanks than fighting in them. Crews developed a grim joke. The Tiger's biggest enemy wasn't the T-34, it was the odometer. Let's go inside a Tiger during Operation Citadel, the Kursk Offensive, July 1943. Bolter's crew has been in position since dawn. The interior smells like oil, sweat, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of spent shell casings. The loader, a 20-year-old named Klaus, is already exhausted. Each 88mm round weighs over 15 kilograms. He's loaded 47 of them today. His hands are blistered. His back screams. The gunner, Stefan, stares through the optic, tracking targets, calling out ranges. The radio operator monitors transmissions, trying to filter useful intelligence from static and contradictory orders. The driver, Otto, feels every vibration through the controls, listening for the sounds that mean something is about to fail, the grinding that precedes a thrown track, the whine that means the transmission is dying. And Belter, in the commander's position, is making calculations that have nothing to do with tactics. Fuel remaining, 1/4 tank. Distance to rally point, 30 kilometers. Probability of reaching it without mechanical failure, unknown. Number of friendly recovery vehicles in the area, 0. The Tiger's gun was magnificent. At 2,000 meters, it could penetrate the frontal armor of any Allied tank in service. Soviet crews learned quickly that engaging a Tiger head-on was suicide. They adapted. They used terrain ambush tactics, coordinated attacks from multiple angles. They accepted losses because they could afford to. The Soviet Union was producing thousands of T-34s. Germany was producing dozens of Tigers per month. The tactical superiority of the individual tank became irrelevant when the enemy could afford to trade 5 tanks for 1 and still come out ahead. But here's the deeper problem. Even when Tigers won engagements, they lost operationally. A T-34 that threw a track could be recovered and repaired in hours. A Tiger with transmission failure might take days to fix if parts were available, if recovery vehicles could reach it, if the tactical situation allowed it. More Tigers were destroyed by their own crews during retreats than were knocked out in combat. When you can't move a 54-ton tank and the enemy is advancing, you blow it up. You set demolition charges. You pour gasoline into the crew compartment. You destroy the breech block so the gun can't be used against you. Then you walk. You walk away from the most powerful tank in the world because it became a stationary pillbox you couldn't defend. Now we need to slow down and understand something about the psychology of the Tiger crews. These men were among the most highly trained soldiers in the Wehrmacht. They had been taught that German armor doctrine was superior, that their equipment was the best, that their training and discipline would see them through. The Tiger was supposed to be the proof of all that. When it worked, it was devastating. Commanders reported engagement ratios that seemed impossible. 1 Tiger versus 12 enemy tanks. All 12 destroyed, the Tiger untouched. Those reports went up the chain of command and reinforced the mythology. What didn't get reported with the same emphasis was the days spent immobile, waiting for parts, cannibalizing other Tigers to keep one operational. What didn't make it into the newsreels was the constant anxiety about fuel, about breakdowns, about being caught immobile when the enemy counterattacked. The Tiger crews began to understand something their commanders refused to accept. Mechanical reliability is a combat multiplier, just as important as armor or firepower. A tank that works is worth 10 that don't. Belter's Tiger throws its right track on the 4th day of Kursk, not from combat damage. From where? The track simply fails, links separate, and 54 tons of steel become an immobile fortress. His crew works for 3 hours in the open, under sporadic artillery fire trying to repair it. They succeed. 2 days later, the transmission fails. This time it's catastrophic. Metal shavings in the oil, gears ground to fragments. The Tiger can move in first gear only, at walking speed. Belter requests recovery. He's told no assets are available. He's ordered to hold position and provide fire support. So they sit. For 18 hours, they sit in a dead tank, using it as a pillbox, waiting for orders that make sense. When the retreat order finally comes, it's too late. They can't retreat. They can blow the tank or surrender it intact. Belter places demolition charges with hands that don't shake. Not because he's not afraid, but because he's done this before. This is his second Tiger. The first one died of a thrown track and fuel starvation 3 months ago. He and his crew walked 12 kilometers to friendly lines, carrying their personal weapons and nothing else. Behind them, the Tiger burns. The irony is staggering. Germany designed the Tiger to be a breakthrough weapon, a tool to shatter enemy formations and restore mobile warfare. Instead, it became a defensive anchor, used to plug holes in crumbling lines, immobilized by its own complexity. Soviet commanders learned to simply bypass Tiger positions when possible. Why assault a prepared Tiger when you can go around it, cut its supply lines, and wait for it to run out of fuel or break down? The Tiger's tactical superiority became strategically irrelevant. It won battles and lost campaigns. It destroyed hundreds of enemy tanks while Germany lost the war. Let's talk about the maintenance burden, because this is where the Tiger's design philosophy collided with reality in the most brutal way. A T-34 was simple, crude even. It could be maintained by conscripts with basic tools. Parts were interchangeable. Entire repair depots could be set up in field conditions. The Tiger was the opposite. It required specialized training to maintain. Its interleaved road wheel system, designed to distribute weight and improve cross-country performance, was a maintenance nightmare. If an inner road wheel failed, you had to remove all the outer wheels to reach it. In freezing conditions, with mud frozen between the wheels, this could take an entire day. The tank's complexity meant that every system depended on every other system working perfectly. One failure cascaded. A fuel pump problem affected engine performance, which stressed the transmission, which increased wear on the final drives. Fixing one problem often revealed 2 more. By 1944, the situation was desperate. Tiger units were operating at fractions of their authorized strength, not because tanks were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced, but because they couldn't be kept operational. Crews became expert scroungers, cannibalizing wrecked Tigers for parts, hoarding gaskets and bearings like currency. Mechanics worked miracles with improvised tools and sheer willpower, and still the Tigers died, not in glorious combat, but in anonymous mechanical failures on muddy roads, in forests, in fields, far from any enemy. Here's where we need to examine the institutional response, because the Panzer leadership's reaction to the Tiger's problems reveals everything about how organizations handle uncomfortable truth. Field reports streamed back to German high command, detailing the problems: excessive fuel consumption, mechanical unreliability, difficulty of maintenance, logistical burden. Some officers took these seriously, revised doctrine, tried to concentrate Tigers in specialized units where they could be properly supported. Others dismissed the complaints. They blamed crew incompetence, poor training, sabotage by foreign workers in the factories. They blamed anything except the fundamental design choices that made the Tiger a logistical albatross. The Panzer Arm kept requesting more Tigers, as if quantity could solve problems rooted in the tank's basic concept. They got the Tiger II instead, even heavier, even more complex, even more prone to breakdown. They doubled down on the very philosophy that was killing their crews. Let's return to Bülter, now commanding his 3rd Tiger, autumn 1944, somewhere in Poland. His crew has changed. Klaus is dead, killed when their 2nd Tiger took a hit that penetrated the side armor during a retreat. The new loader is 16 years old, trained for 3 weeks, terrified. The gunner is on his 2nd tour in Tigers and drinks whenever he can find alcohol. The driver has been with Bülter since the beginning and doesn't talk anymore, just drives, listens, waits for the inevitable. They're supporting a defensive line that exists on maps, but barely in reality. Fuel is rationed. Ammunition is scarce. Every Tiger movement is calculated in terms of fuel expenditure versus tactical necessity. They're down to playing defense with a weapon designed for offense, rationing ammunition in a tank with the best gun on the battlefield, immobile more often than moving because there's no fuel for training, for repositioning, for anything except immediate combat necessity. The final bitter irony: when Tigers were abandoned during the retreat through Poland and into Germany itself, recovery crews found that many of them had no combat damage. They were mechanically intact but immobile, dead from broken transmissions, thrown tracks, empty fuel tanks. Crews had walked away from operational weapons because they couldn't move them. The Tiger's legend grew even as the actual tanks died inglorious deaths in ditches and forests, destroyed by their own side to prevent capture. Now we need to examine what this meant to the men inside. Belter knew by late 1944 that the Tiger was as much trap as weapon. He knew that climbing into the commander's cupola meant accepting that mechanical failure was more likely than enemy action to end your day. He knew that every mission might end with thermite grenades and a long walk, but he climbed in anyway, because orders, because duty, because what else was there? His crew knew it too. They performed maintenance rituals with desperate attention to detail, checking every system, hoarding every spare part, because their lives depended on a machine that was designed without sufficient regard for the humans who had to keep it running under combat conditions. Think about the position these crews were in. They possessed direct personal knowledge that the Tiger's reputation exceeded its reliability. They lived with the gap between what propaganda claimed and what they experienced. They could either report honestly, detail every failure, every limitation, and risk being labeled defeatist, or they could file reports that emphasized successes and downplayed systemic problems. Most did both. They were honest with each other and their immediate commanders. They softened the truth as it went up the chain. This is how institutions maintain comfortable illusions, even as ground truth deteriorates. The men who knew the most had the least power to change anything. The Western Allies encountered Tigers with a mixture of fear and respect. American and British tank crews learned that frontal engagement was suicide. They adapted tactics, flanking attacks, air support, artillery, overwhelming numbers. They took losses, but they kept coming because they could afford losses, because their tanks were reliable enough to execute complex maneuvers, because their logistics could sustain operations. When an Allied tank was disabled, recovery vehicles brought it back. When it was destroyed, factories replaced it. The math was brutal but simple. The Allies could trade tanks for Tigers and win through attrition. Germany couldn't trade Tigers for anything. Each loss was irreplaceable, not because factories couldn't build them, but because the entire concept was unsustainable. Soviet crews developed their own Tiger hunting tactics. They learned to target the tracks, the engine deck, the thinner side armor. They used terrain to negate the Tiger's range advantage. They coordinated attacks, accepting that the first 2 or 3 tanks would die to kill the Tiger. They could accept that math. More importantly, they understood something German high command refused to admit. Tank warfare is a logistical competition as much as a tactical one. The side that can keep its tanks running, fueled and armed will win regardless of individual vehicle superiority. By the end of the war, Tiger crews were a haunted brotherhood. They had served in what was supposed to be an elite formation, the armored tip of the spear, and watched it disintegrate not through combat losses, but through mechanical attrition and logistical collapse. They had experienced the cognitive dissonance of operating a weapon that was simultaneously devastating and fragile, powerful and unreliable, legendary and fatally flawed. Some struggled after the war to reconcile their experience with the Tiger's mythology. Others simply never spoke about it, carrying private knowledge that contradicted public memory. Here's what the Tiger story reveals about weapons design and military effectiveness. Complexity is a tax paid in maintenance hours, spare parts, and operational availability. The Tiger was optimized for a specific scenario: short-range offensives with robust logistics, fighting enemy tanks in direct engagement at medium to long range. It excelled in that scenario. The Eastern Front after 1943 was not that scenario. It was long retreats, extended supply lines, defensive warfare, fuel shortages, and enemies who adapted their tactics to avoid the Tiger's strengths and exploit its weaknesses. The tank that was supposed to restore German superiority instead became a symbol of industrial overreach, of designing for the war you want rather than the war you're fighting. There's a deeper truth here about certainty and self-deception. The Tiger program continued receiving resources even as Germany's strategic position collapsed. More complex variants were designed and produced. The Tiger II, even heavier, even more mechanically complex, entered service in 1944 when Germany desperately needed simple, reliable, easily maintained tanks that could be produced in large numbers. The institutional commitment to the Tiger concept overrode the evidence that it was the wrong weapon for Germany's situation. This is how organizations fail. By doubling down on approaches that worked in different circumstances, by letting mythology override data, by confusing tactical excellence with strategic wisdom. Bülter survived the war. His third Tiger was destroyed by American aircraft in March 1945, caught in the open during a daylight movement. The crew abandoned it and scattered. He walked west, away from the advancing Soviets, and surrendered to American forces in April. In the POW camp, he met other Tiger commanders. They swapped stories, compared experiences, tried to make sense of what they'd been through. None of them claimed the Tiger was a bad tank. It wasn't. It was an excellent tank deployed in the wrong war at the wrong time by a nation that couldn't sustain it. That's a very different kind of failure. It's not about the engineering. It's about the gap between what a weapons system requires and what a nation at war can provide. After the war, the Tiger's legend grew. Films, books, documentaries focused on its impressive combat record, its thick armor, its powerful gun. They showed Tigers destroying enemy tanks, dominating battlefields, serving as the backbone of desperate defensive stands. All of that is true. What they didn't show was the days between engagements, the constant mechanical failures, the fuel shortages, the crews working through the night to replace a transmission, the Tigers abandoned because they couldn't move, the slow realization that they were riding in a magnificent machine that was killing them through complexity. Bülter watched the Tiger mythology develop and said very little publicly. What could he say? That the legend was both true and false? That the Tiger was simultaneously the best heavy tank of the war and a logistical disaster? That you could be right about the vehicle and wrong about its role? That's a complexity most people don't want to hear. The final toll is difficult to calculate. Roughly 350 Tigers were produced. Perhaps half were destroyed by enemy action. The rest were abandoned, scuttled, or mechanically destroyed by the very complexity that made them formidable. The crews who served in them were among the most highly trained soldiers in the Wehrmacht. Many died not in combat, but in the chaos of retreats, in ambushes during transfers, in accidents caused by exhausted maintenance crews. The Tiger killed through mechanical failure, leading to tactical immobility, leading to encirclement. It killed through fuel consumption that left formations stranded. It killed by absorbing resources that could have produced 3 or 4 simpler, more reliable tanks. Think about what this means for the nature of military effectiveness. The Tiger succeeded at its design goals: heavy armor, powerful gun, ability to dominate enemy tanks in direct combat. It failed at the operational goals: sustained mobile warfare, logistical sustainability, battlefield availability. This gap between design success and operational failure is the story of the Tiger. It's what happens when you optimize for performance and underweight reliability. It's what happens when you design for the ideal scenario and ignore the messy reality of actual war. It's what happens when institutional prestige becomes invested in a concept that the evidence increasingly contradicts. The Tiger crews understood this long before their commanders did. They felt it in every thrown track, every transmission failure, every moment of anxiety when the engine coughed or the steering resisted. They knew they were riding in a weapon that demanded more from them than it could deliver. Not because they were inadequate, not because they lacked discipline or training, but because the Tiger asked its crews to compensate through skill and willpower for design choices that created operational fragility. They couldn't do it. Nobody could have. So here's the question the Tiger story leaves us with. How many times do we commit to a course of action based on how we want things to be rather than how they are? How often do we double down on complexity when simplicity would serve us better? How frequently do we mistake excellence in one dimension for adequacy in all dimensions? The Tiger was an excellent tank. It was also a trap, one that killed as much through its demands as through enemy action. Those two things are both true. Holding them both in your mind at once, accepting the contradiction, is uncomfortable. It's easier to remember only the legend, the 88mm gun, the thick armor, the combat victories. But the crews who served in Tigers remember something more complete and more troubling. They remember the best tank that wasn't good enough, the weapon that became a burden, the moment when they realized that everything they'd been taught about, quality defeating quantity, was true in battles and false in wars. Bülter died in 1989, long after the war, long after the Tiger became legend. In private conversations, he would sometimes talk about his time in Tigers, but his stories weren't the heroic narratives people expected. He talked about maintenance schedules, fuel calculations, the sound a transmission makes before it fails. He talked about the gap between the tank they trained on and the tank they fought in, between the promises made at Kummersdorf and the reality at Kursk. He talked about decisions made in cupolas and crew compartments, about whether to advance knowing you might not be able to retreat, about staying with a broken tank or abandoning it, about the weight of commanding a weapon that was simultaneously your greatest asset and your most fundamental liability. Those aren't the stories that made it into the legend, but they're the true ones. The Tiger. I was Germany's heavy monster. It dominated battlefields when it ran. It became a death trap not through bad armor or weak guns, but through mechanical complexity that exceeded Germany's ability to sustain it under combat conditions. The crews knew it. They served anyway. They kept faith with the machine even as it failed them, not because they were naive, but because that's what soldiers do. They maintained the gap between what they believed and what they experienced until the evidence became overwhelming. And even then, even after the war, many of them struggled to articulate what they'd learned, because admitting the Tiger was flawed felt like admitting their service was wasted. And that's not a truth anyone wants to carry. So the legend persists, the mythology of German armor superiority, the Tiger as symbol of technical excellence. And buried underneath, invisible to everyone except those who were there, is the other truth. The weight of 54 tons that couldn't move, the sound of a transmission dying, the moment you realize the weapon that was supposed to save you is the thing that's killing you. Slowly, through mathematics and maintenance, through fuel consumption and complexity, through the brutal physics of logistics that no amount of courage or discipline can overcome. That's what happened when Germany built the best tank it could imagine and discovered that the best isn't always good enough, that excellence in design doesn't guarantee effectiveness in deployment, that winning engagements means nothing if you can't sustain operations. The Tiger crews learned that lesson in frozen fields and burning wrecks, in long walks away from abandoned machines, in the gap between propaganda and reality. They learned it the hardest way possible, by living it, fighting it, and for many of them, dying because of it. The Tiger, I was Germany's legend and Germany's trap, and it was both those things at once, completely and simultaneously. And that's the truth nobody wanted to hear then and most people still don't want to hear now. But it's the truth that matters, the one the crews carried, the one that explains why the most powerful tank of World War II became a monument to the difference between what you can build and what you can sustain, between the weapon you want and the weapon you can actually keep running when everything is falling apart and the enemy is advancing, and all you have left is 54 tons of steel that won't move and a decision about whether to stay or walk away.